My father has never been able to recognize faces. To him, a human countenance is a puzzle that shifts and rearranges itself every time he blinks. He navigates the world by voice, by context, by the careful placement of name cards at dinner parties. He has built an empire, married a woman he cannot visually identify, and fathered children he knows only by the sound of their footsteps. This is not a metaphor. This is a medical condition, prosopagnosia, the neurologists call it, and it has shaped the entire architecture of my family's tragedy. 40 years ago, at a charity gala hosted by the Sterling family, my father was drugged. The drug was a crude thing, slipped into his champagne by a woman named Celeste Moreau, a social climber from a crumbling old money family who had set her sights on the heir to the Vance fortune. The drug was meant to disorient him, to make him vulnerable to seduction, to create a scandal that would force a marriage, but Celeste miscalculated. The drug worked too well. My father stumbled out of the ballroom and into the garden, where a young woman named Rose Chun was sitting alone on a stone bench, reading a book of poetry by the light of the moon. Rose Chun was a scholarship student at Columbia, a literature major who had been hired to work the gala as a server. She had slipped away during her break to read Wordsworth in the quiet of the garden. She was 20 years old, the daughter of immigrants, the first person in her family to attend college. She had never been to a gala before. She had never met anyone like my father before, a man who spoke to her as if she were the only person in the world, who quoted poetry back to her, who looked at her with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time in her life, utterly seen. What Rose didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that my father was looking at her that way because he was trying desperately to memorize her face. The drug was scrambling his already impaired facial recognition, and he was fighting to hold onto her features before they dissolved into the blur that was his entire visual world. He didn't succeed. By morning, he couldn't have picked her out of a lineup, but he remembered the poetry, he remembered the moonlight, and he remembered that for one night, he had felt less alone. Celeste's plan succeeded despite her miscalculation. She claimed that she had been the one in the garden. She claimed that my father had promised to marry her. And my father, who couldn't recognize her face, who couldn't contradict her, who was too ashamed to admit that he had been drugged and had no memory of the night at all, my father believed her. He married her 6 months later. They became the golden couple of New York society, the picture-perfect marriage, the empire-building partnership. She gave him 2 children. She managed his social calendar, and every time he looked at her, he saw a stranger. Meanwhile, Rose Chun discovered she was pregnant. She told no one. She returned to her small town in upstate New York, where she gave birth to a daughter she named Alara, after the heroine of the Wordsworth poem she had been reading in the garden. She raised Alara alone, working double shifts at a textile mill, enduring the whispers and the judgment of a town that labeled her a fallen woman. She never married. She never asked for help. And she never told Alara the name of her father, only that he had been a man who quoted poetry and then disappeared. I am Alara Vance. Rose Chun was my mother. And 40 years after that night in the garden, I walked into the Whitmore estate as the wife of Charles Whitmore, the heir to the largest real estate fortune in the state. I had married into the very world that had destroyed my mother, the world of galas and old money and carefully curated reputations. I had done it not by scheming or seduction, but by being smarter, sharper, and more relentless than anyone who had ever underestimated me. Charles loved me. His family respected me. And I had spent 20 years building a position so unassailable that no one, not the society matrons who whispered about my humble origins, not the business rivals who had tried to block my ascension, not the ghosts of the past, could touch me. The day my son brought his girlfriend home, I was sitting in the high-backed armchair in the formal sitting room of Whitmore Manor, the chair that had belonged to Charles's grandmother and that now belonged, by unspoken agreement, to me. I was the undisputed matriarch of this house, and my word was law. And the girl sitting across from me, a delicate, doe-eyed blonde with an easy smile and the unearned confidence of someone who had never suffered a day in her life, was asking for my blessing to marry my son. She was beautiful. She was polished. She was the product of every privilege the world could bestow, and I recognized her immediately, not because I had met her before. I hadn't. But because she had her grandfather's nose and her grandmother's hazel eyes. She was the spitting image of Celeste Moreau, and her name was Victoria Ashford. My father's legitimate granddaughter, the heir to the fortune that should have been mine. And she had no idea who I was. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her voice sweet and practiced, I know this is sudden, but I love your son. I love him more than anything, and I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making him happy. She held out a small, beautifully wrapped gift, a box of expensive chocolates, the kind you buy at the sort of boutique that doesn't list prices. It was a thoughtful gesture, a perfectly calibrated offering from a girl who had been trained her entire life to charm her way into any room. I looked at the gift. I looked at the girl. I looked at the face that had destroyed my mother's life. And I did not take the box. "You want to marry into the Whitmore family?" I said, my voice calm and cold. "You will do so over my dead body." The room went silent. My son, my sweet, oblivious, beautiful boy, stared at me with open-mouthed shock. "Mom, what are you doing? You haven't even given her a chance." "She doesn't need a chance. She needs to leave." I stood up from the chair, my posture straight, my voice carrying the full weight of 40 years of grief and fury. "Victoria Ashford, you are the granddaughter of Harold Vance and Celeste Moreau. Your grandmother destroyed my mother's life. She drugged my father at a gala, claimed a night that was not hers, and built a marriage on a foundation of lies. Your family's fortune, the fortune that paid for your education, your wardrobe, your entire existence, was built on the theft of my mother's dignity." Victoria's face had gone white. My grandmother? What are you talking about? My grandparents have been married for 40 years. They're the most respected couple in. Your grandparents' marriage is a fraud. Your grandfather has face blindness. He couldn't recognize your grandmother if she walked into this room. He married her because she lied to him, because she claimed to be the woman he met in the garden, because he was too ashamed to admit he couldn't remember. The woman he actually met, the woman he spent that night with, was my mother, Rose Chindo, scholarship student who worked as a server. A woman who was thrown away like nothing while your grandmother took her place. "You're lying." Victoria's voice trembled. "You're making this up to hurt me. My grandparents love each other. They've always loved each other. Your grandmother has spent 40 years looking over her shoulder, waiting for the truth to come out. She knows exactly what she did, and she knows that one day, the bill would come due." I stepped closer, my voice dropping. "That day is today. You are not going to marry my son. You're going to walk out of this house, and you're going to tell your grandmother that Alara Vance, Rose Chen's daughter, says hello." Victoria fled, and my son chased after her, his face a mask of confusion and heartbreak. And I stood alone in the sitting room, my hands trembling, my heart pounding, the weight of 40 years finally beginning to lift. The confrontation I had set in motion was not a spontaneous outburst. It was the culmination of a plan I had been building for years, a plan rooted in evidence, patience, and the absolute refusal to let my mother's erasure stand. Victoria, I knew, would run straight to her grandmother, and Celeste Moreau Vance, the woman who had stolen my mother's life, would finally have to face the consequences of what she had done. What Victoria and Celeste didn't know, what no one in the Ashford family knew, was that I had been preparing for this day since the moment I first learned the truth about my father. I had DNA evidence that I had the testimony of the bartender who had witnessed Celeste slip the drug into Harold's champagne. I had letters my mother had written to my father, letters that had been intercepted and destroyed by Celeste's allies, but that I had reconstructed through decades of painstaking investigation. I had the original guest list from the gala, showing that my mother had been hired as a server. I had the medical records documenting my father's prosopagnosia and the testimony of the neurologist who had diagnosed him. And I had a recorded conversation, obtained through channels I would never disclose, in which Celeste admitted, to a confidant she thought she could trust, that she had embellished the story of how she and Harold met. I had been gathering evidence since I was 18 years old. Every piece of the puzzle had been cataloged, preserved, and prepared. And now, finally, I was ready to deploy it. Victoria returned 3 days later. She was not alone. Behind her came Celeste Moreau Vance, 72 years old and still striking, her posture rigid with aristocratic fury. Behind Celeste came my father, Harold Vance, 81 years old, his face a mask of confusion and dawning dread. And behind them, trailing like a funeral procession, came an entourage of lawyers, publicists, and family retainers who had been summoned to manage a crisis none of them fully understood. Celeste stopped in the center of the sitting room, her eyes blazing. "How dare you?" she said, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you spread these lies about me? I've been married to Harold for 40 years, so I have been a faithful wife and a devoted mother. And you're nothing but a gold digger who married into the Whitmore family and thinks she can rewrite history." I didn't flinch. "You drugged my father at the Sterling Gala 40 years ago. You claimed a night that was not yours. You destroyed my mother's life and built your own on the ruins. Did I have the evidence? I have the testimony. Did I have the DNA? You want to do this publicly? Because I'm ready." My father stepped forward, his eyes, those pale hazel eyes that I had inherited, that Victoria had inherited, searching my face. "What is she talking about, Celeste?" Celeste's composure cracked. "She's lying. She's been lying for years. Harold, you know me. You know I would never. I don't know you, my father said quietly. I've never known you to have spent 40 years trying to memorize your face, and I still can't. Every morning, I wake up next to a stranger. I've been too ashamed to tell anyone, but I know this. I know that the woman in the garden quoted Wordsworth. She talked about the moon. She made me feel, for one night, like I wasn't alone. And you have never once, in 40 years, quoted poetry to me. The silence that followed was the most profound I have ever heard. Celeste stared at her husband, her mouth open, her face pale. Victoria was weeping, her hands pressed to her face. And my father turned to me, his voice trembling. Your mother, Rose Chindarai, is she still? She died 8 years ago. She never married. She never stopped loving you. She told me, on her deathbed, that the night in the garden was the most beautiful night of her life. She made me promise to tell you, if I ever met you, that she forgave you, that she knew you couldn't help it, that she hoped you had found happiness. My father, the titan of industry, the man who had built an empire from nothing, sank into a chair and wept like a child. Celeste watched him, her face a mask of fury and despair. She had spent 40 years building a life on a lie, and in the space of a single afternoon, I had torn it apart. The public reckoning came 3 weeks later at the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, the most prestigious charity event of the year, attended by 900 of the city's most powerful and influential people. I had chosen the date carefully. IT was the same gala, held in the same ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel, as the one where my mother had been destroyed. And it was there at that event that I would tell the world the truth. Celeste had tried to stop me. She had threatened lawsuits, hired private investigators, attempted to bribe my household staff into digging up dirt, but I had been too careful. The evidence was overwhelming, and by the time the gala arrived, a dozen journalists had already been briefed. The truth was going to come out. The only question was whether Celeste would be there to face it. She was there. She had no choice. Her entire life was built on appearances, and if she had failed to appear at the Whitmore Gala, the rumors would have started without her. So she came, dressed in a gown of ice blue silk, her diamonds glittering like armor. Victoria came with her, pale and trembling, and my father came alone. He had moved out of the Ashford mansion 2 weeks earlier, after 40 years of marriage, and was staying in a suite at a hotel while he figured out what to do with the rest of his life. When the moment came, I took the stage. The microphone was already live. The screens behind me, which had been displaying the Whitmore Foundation logo, flickered and went dark, and I began to speak. Good evening. My name is Alara Vance Whitmore. Most of you know me as the wife of Charles Whitmore and the chairwoman of this foundation. But before I was any of those things, I was the daughter of Rose Chun, a scholarship student from Columbia, a server at this very gala 40 years ago, and the woman who should have been Harold Vance's wife. The room went silent. 900 faces turned toward me, and behind me, on the screens, the first images appeared. M.Y. Mother's photograph, the guest list from the 1983 Sterling Gala. The letter my mother had written to my father, the one that had been intercepted, the DNA test results, the testimony of the bartender who had seen Celeste slip the drug into the champagne. The medical records of my father's face blindness, and the recorded conversation in which Celeste admitted, in her own voice, that she had embellished the story of how she and Harold met. I told the story, all of it, the garden, the drug, the lie, the 40 years of exile my mother endured, and when I was done, the room was utterly silent. Celeste Moreau Vance was sitting at a table near the front, her face ashen, her hands gripping the tablecloth as if she were drowning. My father was standing at the back of the room, tears streaming down his face. Victoria was weeping. And the journalists, the dozen who had been tipped off, plus 2 dozen more who were now scrambling to file their stories, were typing furiously. This is not a story about revenge, I said, my voice steady. It is a story about truth, and why mother lived her entire life in the shadow of a lie. She died without ever being acknowledged. I am standing here tonight to make sure that her name, Rose Chin, is remembered, and I am standing here to say that the truth, no matter how long it is buried, will always come out. Third-party objective commentary by Dr. Helena Murin, investigative journalist and author of Faces of Power, The Vance Dynasty Exposed. What makes the Vance Whitmore case so extraordinary is not merely the scale of the deception, though 40 years is remarkable by any measure, but the precision with which the truth was ultimately deployed. Alara Vance Whitmore did not act on impulse when Victoria Ashford walked into her sitting room. She did not lash out in pain, though she had every right to. She executed a plan that had been decades in the making, with the discipline of a prosecutor and the patience of a predator. The face blindness detail is particularly devastating because it transforms Harold Vance from a simple adulterer into something far more tragic. A man trapped in his own neurology, incapable of recognizing the woman he loved or the woman who lied to him. Celeste exploited a medical condition for personal gain, a detail that, when it emerged in court, turned public opinion decisively against her. The public reckoning, Alara's speech at the gala, must be understood as a form of restorative justice. She did not sue for damages, though she could have won millions. She did not demand that her father's marriage be annulled. What she demanded was acknowledgement. Rose Chen's name, spoken aloud in the same ballroom where she had been erased. The crime was not merely the theft of a night, IT was the theft of a life, and acknowledgement, in cases of historical erasure, is the only form of justice that truly matters. Victoria Ashford, the delicate, doe-eyed granddaughter, is a tragic figure in her own right. She was not responsible for her grandmother's crimes, and her heartbreak at losing the man she loved was genuine. But Alara's refusal to accept her, "You will do so over my dead body," was not an act of cruelty. IT was an act of self-protection. Allowing the granddaughter of the woman who destroyed her mother to marry her son would have been its own kind of erasure. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Celeste Moreau Vance was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and the administration of a noxious substance, the drug she had slipped into Harold's champagne 40 years earlier. The statute of limitations had long since expired on the drugging itself, but the fraud, the decades of marriage built on a false premise, the inheritance she had secured through deception, was still actionable. She was convicted on 17 counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. She died of a stroke in the 3rd year of her incarceration. My father, Harold Vance, spent the remaining years of his life trying to make amends. He established the Rose Chin Scholarship Fund for first-generation college students, funded entirely by the sale of the Ashford Mansion and the dissolution of the family trust. He learned to recognize my face, not through sight, but through the sound of my voice and the way I walked and the perfume I wore, the same perfume my mother had worn in the garden. He told me, in his final year, that I had her eyes. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. Victoria Ashford did not marry my son. She moved to Europe after her grandmother's conviction, changed her name, and started a new life far from the wreckage of her family's legacy. I received a letter from her once, a single page, handwritten, in which she apologized for the hurt her family had caused and thanked me for telling the truth. I didn't reply, but I kept the letter in a drawer in my desk, alongside my mother's photograph and the copy of Wordsworth that she had been reading in the garden. I am 72 years old, now, and my husband Charles is 80, still sharp, still kind, still the best decision I ever made. My son is 45, a father himself now, his children playing in the gardens of Whitmore Manor the way he once did, and I am still the matriarch. Not by accident of birth, but by the force of my will and the depth of my love for the woman who raised me. The daughter of the fallen woman became the most powerful woman in the city, and the truth that was buried for 40 years is now written in stone.